everyone, I've got a Zipper Skills video for you today. We are going to be talking about installing curved zippers. I'm going to be doing curved zippers in two parts. I'm going to do the convex zippers, which are the outward going curves, as well as the concave zippers, which are the inwards going curves. Because the skills used for these two different types of curved zipper installation build on each other, we're going to start with the simpler of the two, which is the convex zipper. As with all of these tutorials, I'm going to be demonstrating on the Pythagorean pouch, but you can use the technique on various different patterns that feature the convex style curved zipper installation. I have added a curved line to the original Pythagorean pouch pattern. If you want to practice this yourself, I will make sure that there is a link to that downloadable pattern template in the description of the video. So let's get going. The biggest issues when installing a convex curved zipper are that the zipper is too short and it leaves a gap at the end of the zipper, and that it dips down, leaving quite a large sized opening at the edge of your pouch. Most patterns that use a convex curved zipper look something like this or something like this. If you have seen my recent video on straightening up the end of your zipper, you may already know where I'm going with this. The issue with patterns that have this basic shape is that at the side here, you're going to get a dip down into your side seam. On a regular style zipper pouch that has a straight zipper across the top, if this edge is straight, that's not going to be an issue. But once you put in a curve here, you are going to introduce a dip at the side. And when you do that, when you go to sew your zipper, it is going to end up dipping down into the side seam. So that is the first problem. The other issue with curved zippers is that often the length that is given for the zipper is not long enough to account for the longer distance across the top of the bag when you have a curve as opposed to a straight line. So I'm going to show you how to fix the dip at the side and how I like to calculate my zipper length so that you get a better fit across the top of your bag. So if you take this example, you can see that the zipper is just a little too short for the top of the pouch and it's dipping down at the end. Whereas on this example, you have a much better fit for the zipper. And in this example, you can see that the end does not dip down. With these types of patterns, both this style with the straight sides and this style with the angled sides, there is often a failure to recognize that this part of the pattern is actually the side of the bag. You may recall from my Nix the Dip video that I talked about how there is a tendency to assume that there's no depth at the top, but that is actually incorrect. There is depth at the top of the bag where part of those main panels wrap around the end of the zipper. So the fix that we're going to do for these convex curved pouches is very similar to the way that we did it in the Nix the Dip video. I'll make sure that that video is linked for you. Working with one of these at a time, I'm just going to demonstrate that fix. You're going to take your ruler. You're going to draw a line that is parallel to this side of the bag, and it's 5/8 of an inch in from the outside edge. That 5/8 of an inch is calculated by the side seam allowance with an extra 1/4 of an inch to account for the finished width of our zipper once it is sewn in place. I like to use a seam allowance that is equal to 1/4 of the starting width of my zipper tape. So for 1 inch wide zipper tape, such as this size 3 tape, I'm going to use 1/4 of an inch as my seam allowance. Once I've sewn both side seams, that is going to leave 1/2 an inch in the center. The same is true for this size 5 zipper tape that is 1¼ of an inch wide. When I sew 5/16 of an inch, that is 1/4 of 1¼ inch, then the exposed width of my finished zipper will be 5/8 of an inch. If you use 3/8 of an inch with a size 5 zipper, then your finished center width is going to be 1/2 an inch. Those measurements are close enough that we can use 5/8 of an inch for correcting the side of our bag. So going back to our pattern piece, we're drawing in a line that is 5/8 of an inch from this outside edge. So we're also going to extend our side seam. And then what we need to do is square the end there. And you want to square it up from the outside line that we've extended across to the point where your 5/8 of an inch line crosses over the original pattern line. So using a line on your ruler to make sure that it is a 90-degree angle, you're going to draw in that perpendicular line. You want to check that they're even. You can also just fold your pattern piece in half and make sure that they're even. And you can see here, this section is how much material on this particular pattern that is missing. If you look here where it hasn't been corrected, that's quite a severe dip. This is the Pythagorean pouch. I have drawn in this curve for the purpose of demonstrating this fix. But there are many patterns out there that are drafted with the curve going all the way across. That it should be corrected to have the straight side here, so that when you look at the side of your bag, it's not dipping down, it's going straight across. The same as we need to have the base of the bag perpendicular to the side seam, we also need to have the top of the bag perpendicular to the side seam to avoid that dip. So rather than have the pattern piece that is curved across the top, like this, we will instead have a pattern piece that looks like this. And that is what we're going to use to cut the curved top Pythagorean pouch. Before we go ahead with that, I'm going to show you how you would square up a bag that has straight sides. So this is just a basic pattern that has the curved top. And again, you can see the curve comes right to the edge. So we're going to draw in a line 5/8 of an inch from the outside, continue up that side seam. 5/8 of an inch again is the side seam allowance plus the extra 1/4 of an inch to account for the width of our zipper tape. If you're using a 5/16 of an inch seam allowance for your zipper, you can add in an extra 1/16 of an inch here if you like. For consistency, I find that 5/8 of an inch works fine. We're then going to square that up, and because this particular pattern begins with straight edges, we can draw a line straight across, squaring that up from the outside edges and crossing over where the curved top meets that inside line. Now normally on a bag with straight edges, you don't need to make this correction because when that is a straight line, there's no dip because it's already straight at the sides. But you can see that at the end here, this is the section that is missing that results in this type of dip at the side of the bag. So that is how you would fix it on that style of bag, and you would also do the same fix on the lining piece. So now that we have our corrected pattern piece, we need to figure out the measurement for our zipper. I'm going to work that out on this piece because I have these lines drawn in. So you want to make sure that you have your 5/8 of an inch line here and you're working on your pattern piece. This fix, because you have to add so much material back in, needs to be done before you cut your material. If you wait to do the fix after you have cut your material, you're going to find yourself still with a bit of a gap because your seam allowance is going to sit here. Now, this is the actual line. So if you're very exact, you can still do it, and then you would just have missing material within your seam allowance. But I strongly recommend doing this fix prior to cutting out your materials. When we are calculating the length of our zipper, we have to consider where the zipper is going to sit on the finished bag and where our seam allowance is. So I'm going to draw in my 5/16 of an inch seam allowance below this curve. If you're doing 1/4 of an inch or 3/8 of an inch, that is the distance down that you're going to draw from this line. So whatever your seam allowance is, draw that in now. I just mark little sections along the way. And you're just marking to those lines. So this line here is the seam allowance where I will install my zipper. Now the actual zipper coils are going to sit here, further above that line. So I want to make sure that my zipper tape is long enough that it covers this entire top area, but not so long that it gets caught in the side when I sew the side seam of my bag and this part wraps around the end of the zipper. So I need to measure this curve. You can use zipper tape or you can use a piece of string. I recommend string that does not have any stretch to it. And you're going to measure the distance between these two lines. So you can take a piece of string and just lay it down on the line that you've drawn in, being careful not to stretch it. And then use that string to measure how long your zipper should be. And I'm coming up with a measurement of 6.5 inches. That is the distance of this curve between these two lines here. That is a longer distance than this top curve here. Once we sew the entire bag and we take our seam allowance, this point here is actually going to be where the edge of that bag will be at the very end of the zipper. So that corresponds to this point here. So if you use this top measurement, it's just going to be a little bit too short. So I'm going to use 6.5 inches for mine. You're going to want to measure your specific pattern. And note that that value may be different to what is given in the pattern. Oftentimes when you have a bag pattern like this, the measurement is taken from this curve at the top here. But unfortunately, this section here that is curved down, but shouldn't be, is quite a bit longer than this little section here. So if the measurement that you're given is based on this full length, your zipper will be too long and you'll end up with pinched in tabs at the end. So draw in your seam allowance and measure it from this line to this line. And mine measures 6.5 inches. That is 6.5 inches for the finished zipper length. So I'm actually going to start with a length that is longer than that. And then I'm going to turn out one end and add a tab to the other end. If you want to use zipper tape to measure, the way that I do that is stand the zipper tape on its end and place it on that line. I like to press it first so that it is nice and smooth. Just hold it up against the line and then I can compare that measurement. And that again is 6.5 inches. So I'm confident that that is going to be a good finished length for my zipper. So now that I know what measurement my zipper is going to be and I have my pattern piece, I can get my materials ready. Place your template down the same as you normally would. My interfacing is just a little bit small here. And then we're going to cut out our pattern piece. Because of the way that these sides angle up, it can be a little tricky. I find that using a smaller rotary cutter can be helpful. You can also draw in those lines to make it a little easier. Repeat that for 2 exteriors and 2 lining pieces. And the curve of the lining piece should match the curve of your exterior. And you can see using this example that if you place the original pattern piece on top of that, all of this material is what was missing that needs to be there to avoid that dip. So now we have our pieces cut, we're going to get our zipper ready. To create the double fold tab for the end of the zipper, take a piece of uninterfaced material. Mine is cut 1 3/4 inch squared. And I'm going to fold it in half, wrong sides together. Because it's a square, it doesn't matter which way I am folding it. And press the fold. Then open it back out. Fold the raw edges in to meet that crease. Again, wrong sides together. And then fold it back in half on the original crease to create the double fold tab. And that will go on the closed end of our zipper. I'm going to cinch the ends of my zipper and fold out the coils. You can do a tab at both ends if you wish. Just make sure that the finished zipper length is correct for the measurement that you have taken from your bag pattern. You can turn out your coils however you like. I'm pretty happy that those are even. So I need 6.5 inches, and that includes where the coils are, and it is also going to include my tab. So 6.5 inches is here. So I'm just going to cut it just barely inside of that because I am going to be putting a tab on the end. Going to cinch this end, place my zipper pull, starting on the side that the tooth is further out so that I have my coils lined back up without any bubbles. Slide that on. And then I have a double fold tab that I'm going to wrap around the end of my zipper. And once I've sewn that on, I will have my completed 6.5 inch zipper. Sewing my tab to the end of my zipper tape, using a longer stitch length, 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, just the same way as we have previously for these open-ended zippers. I've sewn that tab on, and now I am going to trim the tab flush with the zipper tape. That is not something that I always do when I'm doing a straight zipper, but on the curved zipper, it does help you to get the edges lined up. So we have 2 exteriors, 2 linings, and our zipper. I'm going to mark the center of my zipper tape on both sides and the centers of these pattern pieces. I'm also going to draw in the 5/8 of an inch line from the outside edge on my lining and on my exterior. I use an erasable pen to do that. Mark those centers, and I'm matching up the coils with the outside edge of my tab. Press that zipper in half and then mark that center. Making sure that the zipper pull is not skewing that center point. Mark the centers on those 4 pattern pieces. And now I'm going to place double-sided tape on all 4 of these pieces between these lines. So just at the very edge of my pattern piece, only to the point where that angle is. When I am installing curved zippers, I find that it is necessary to put small snips into your zipper tape to get it to sit nicely. That is particularly important if you have a steeper curve or a deeper curve when you are installing your zipper. If you look at your zipper tape, when it is sitting flat, it curves pretty well both ways. But once you install it in a bag, it tends to fold over like this. Once it is folded over, it becomes a lot more difficult to curve. For a concave curve, particularly, that is difficult, but even for a convex curve, it does become tricky and you end up with waves in your zipper. If you take small little wedges out of that zipper tape, that will help it to sit more nicely inside of your bag, and it will get rid of this ripple here. I know a lot of people don't like snipping their zipper tapes. In my experience, if I add fray check, I have not had any fraying, and I find that it helps the zipper to sit much more nicely in my finished bag. If you don't want to do it, that is totally up to you. I'm going to link a video. It is not one of my videos, it's a Spencer Ogg video where she talks about the different types of weave in your zipper tape so that you can determine if the zipper tape that you are using would be safe to snip or not. Any zipper tape that has the vertical stripes, so the stripes that go this way across your tape, you don't ever want to snip that, but it's worth checking out. It's a really great video. Something else to consider with curved zippers is size 3 zipper tape has much smaller coils that are a lot less rigid than size 5 zipper coils are. If you struggle and you don't want to snip your zips, using a size 3 zipper rather than a size 5 is a good option to help you get a better shape on your finished bag. So back to our zipper installation. I am going to be putting small snips in the zipper, first to get it basted, and then I will take the wedges when we go to top stitch our zipper. So I'm just going to put small snips about 1/8 of an inch in from the outside edge, about every 3/4 of an inch. And once I have those in, that is going to help that zipper to take the shape that I want it to take. The first thing I'm going to do is baste my zipper to my exterior. I'm going to remove the backing from the double-sided tape on one side. And the first thing that I want to do is match up the center point on my zipper tape with the center point on my exterior. And my coils are right sides down on my exterior fabric. Now, when we do a straight zipper, I generally tell you to press along from the center out to the sides so that you get a nice even zipper. However, the zipper tape length is not the same as this section here, so I don't actually want to use that to press it down. I'm going to end up with waves in my zipper, and my zipper is going to be too short on my finished bag. I want the tab to sit a little further along from where that angled point is, because I want the fold to meet up with the line here. If you have an erasable pen, you can draw that in on the front to help guide you. But what we're going to do is actually overshoot that angled point by about 1/8 of an inch. And then I'm going to use my ruler to measure and pull it over. And I want it to be just around 5/8 of an inch from this outside edge at the line where my seam allowance will be. And I'm going to place a clip to hold that in position. So you can see that it just comes across a little bit. And then I'm going to press it down at the outside edge. Placing a clip in the middle helps everything stay in position. And then at the other end, I'm going to do the same thing. So I want my zipper coils to go past that angled section. And then I can measure again. And I want it to be 5/8 of an inch in at the line where our seam allowance is. And that should correspond on the back. This line on the back should match up. And I'm going to press that along there too. And now I'm going to baste the first side of that zipper in position. And then you'll be able to see where the stitch line is on the back. Basting at 1/8 of an inch, just where the zipper tape is. I also like to just check that the gap is pretty similar between both ends, and then take my lining piece, remove the backing of the lining also, and then I'm going to match up the center point. That zipper is already basted to my exterior, so I can just press the exterior and the lining together with those upper edges that match up, transferring the top of the exterior piece to the top of the lining piece if they have a different shape. And we're now going to be sewing this with the full seam allowance. I'm going to be using a seam allowance of 5/16 of an inch. That is what I used when I drew in my zipper seam allowance. So you're going to use whatever seam allowance it is that you used when you drew that in earlier. We're going to start at the end, and we're going to be sewing parallel to this line that we drew in until we get to this 5/8 of an inch line. Then we're going to turn and sew along the curve till we get to this 5/8 of an inch line, and then we're going to come back up here to sew parallel to that straight edge there. So we're going to end up with this sort of shape. I'm going to be using my shorter stitch length and my zipper foot. You can draw in that seam allowance line if you like for accuracy. I use the width of my zipper foot to gauge my seam allowance, so I have not drawn it in. So I'm sewing straight up to that line that we drew in at 5/8 of an inch from this edge, and then I'm turning to sew 5/16 of an inch from the curve. My zipper pull is here. I'm going to slide it back so that I don't get an uneven row of stitches next to where that is. This is my end of the zipper with the coils. I'm just using my stiletto to help the material hug around. And the coils should be just inside that line where the seam allowance is. It can be a little tricky to get over. If you have a hump jumper, you can use that to help. And when you get to the line, you're going to pivot again and sew up to the other edge. Back stitch. So this is my zipper seam. It angles down, then it follows the curve and angles back up. And when I flip that around, if I follow the fold, you can see that this is the original curve at the top of the bag. And that's kind of the way that the bag wants to sit. However, when we get to the side, if we were to sew two mirrored pieces together here, we would have that dip at the top. But because of the fix, well, we've added that material back in. Now we can pull this bit out. And when we do go to sew the side, we will have a nice flat side on our bag without that dip at the end of the zipper. In order to get that to sit nice and flat, place a small snip into the seam allowance, making sure that you're not cutting through your stitches. I like to stop about 1/8 of an inch from that pivot point. And you're just snipping through your exterior and your lining. You're not snipping into your zipper. So if you're somebody who doesn't like to snip your zipper tape, you should still place this snip. And that is going to help that top seam of your bag sit nice and flat. Once that snip is there, that little end bit just pulls out much more nicely. And you can see if I flip this open, that because this part of the zipper has more length when the zipper is curved around, it's a little wavy there. And that is why I like to take those little wedges. You don't have to take the wedges. You can sew that zipper with those waves there. It just may be noticeable on your finished bag. So I'm going to take some small wedges out of my zipper tape and then put some fray check on those before I top stitch. So with those little wedges taken out, let me show you the difference. If I fold it back under, that just sits a little more nicely. And once it's top stitched, there's going to be a lot less bulk at that top edge. So I'm going to apply some fray check. Then I'm going to flip that around and I'm going to press my exterior and my lining away from my zipper tape. And I'm going to make sure that at the side here, I'm pressing that fold so that it sits nice and straight. If you leave it tucked under like this, you're going to undo all of your hard work and still end up with a dip at the side of your bag. So you want to really make sure that you're pulling that up. So now we can top stitch the first side of the zipper. When we're top stitching, the same way as we would when we have a straight zipper, we can choose to top stitch along the entire top of the bag if we do not top stitch through our lining. On this style of zipper, that is a little bit trickier because the lining is going to kind of be in the way a bit. You can sew just through the exterior though. You just have to be careful of that lining. It's especially tricky when you get to the second side. The other option is to top stitch through your exterior and your lining, but only from the edge of your zipper coils to the edge of your zipper tab, leaving this section unsewn at the end so that when you sew your side seam, you can still pull it out to be nice and straight. So you can choose which of those you want to do and go ahead and top stitch next to your zipper. It can be helpful to use some double-sided tape to keep the seam allowance pressed towards the exterior, just by placing double-sided tape on this side and pressing that down. Especially if you are going to attempt to sew just the exterior and not the lining, that makes that a lot easier. So doing it that way, you're just going to be sewing in this part here. Now let's give it a go. So I'm going to be moving my lining out of the way, and I'm going to sew along next to the fold of my zipper. And I'm going to be sewing at 1/8 of an inch from the fold at my top zipper seam. I like to start my back stitching in the side seam allowance, longer stitch length. And because I'm doing it in this kind of awkward curved shape, I need to make sure that the lining doesn't tuck back underneath my zipper here. I'm really going to have to pull that out. So I'm going to take it nice and slowly, make sure that everything is nice and smooth and I'm not catching that lining accidentally. But you can alternatively just sew between the ends of the zipper, sewing both the exterior and the lining together. The pivot point is where the curve starts. Slide the zipper pull out of the way. Make sure that lining is nice and smooth. And when we get to the other end of the zipper, make sure that this straight part is still straight and that it hasn't tucked underneath. It feels kind of awkward pulling it out because it's not where the material wants to go, but it's where it needs to go in order to maintain that straight upper edge at the side of your bag. So I've completed that first side, and now I'm going to attach the second side of my zipper. You can, if you like, do the steps for both sides as you go rather than doing one side start to finish. The important thing is making sure that all of the points match up where they should be. So the center of the zipper on the second side, matching up with the exterior center. Add a clip to help it stay in position. And then the tab is going to go just past where that angle is in the exterior. And then we're going to check that measurement with our ruler. We want that tab to be 5/8 of an inch from this edge at the level of our zipper seam allowance. Can probably just come over a tiny bit, and that should correspond with the line on the back. And then you can ease your zipper out to meet the edge of your material. Those snips can help. Come to the other end, zipper coils just past that angled section. Check on the back, measure again, adjust it if necessary, and then clip at the other end. The key points are making sure that the ends of your zipper and the center of your zipper are where they need to be based on those landmarks. Press that down. And I'm going to base that at 1/8 of an inch. Before we attach the lining, you can just check that that placement is pretty close. And then we can remove the backing from the lining piece, match up the curve and the outside edges, making sure that the center points match up. And then we're going to sew through the exterior, the zipper tape, and the lining using the same seam allowance as we did for the first side, starting at the outside edge parallel to the straight section and then we're going to follow the curve, pivot, and come parallel to the straight section at the other end. Can be a little trickier with the zipper coils there, so if you need to use your hump jumper to get over them, be sure to do that. Make sure that the first side is well out of the way. Slide the zipper pull as necessary. Pivot when you get to the line here at 5/8 of an inch from this edge. Then the same as on the first side, put that little snip at either end of the zipper. You can see that it is not snipping through the zipper tape or the tab, and that will help this curve and this side to sit nicely, even if you decide not to put the snips into your zipper. I'm going to do the wedges on this side like I did on the first side. Then I'll add my fray check and press that away from the zipper tape. Can be easier to press it with the zipper open. Just pull on the coils, and again making sure that this outside edge here is pushed nice and flat so that you get that straight edge on your finished bag. And press that also. Then I'm going to top stitch the second side of the zipper. It's going to be trickier than the first side was because the second side is attached, but I'm going to give it a go. So I'm just going to be sewing through the exterior on this side of the zipper, keeping the lining out of the way. So I'm going to be sewing inside the curve here. Starting in the side seam, making sure everything is smoothed out. Keep the first side well out of the way and that lining well out of the way. This is why it's a little tricky. Pivot when I get up to the end of the zipper, make sure that lining is smoothed out. I'm going to check it intimately to make sure that the lining is not bunching up. And I can open out my zipper. That will make it easier to keep everything out of the way. Following the curve up to the end of the zipper. And then I'm going to pivot to do that last little section. If you have top stitched through your exterior and your lining together, you're not going to be sewing this section here. So I've got my zipper installed and top stitched. Now I need to finish sewing up the bag. You can see that it's got a little bit of an unusual shape at the moment, but once it is sewn and we sew those side seams, we will have our nice curved zipper at the top, and these seams will be sewn together to give us a nice flat end at the end of our zipper. So the rest of the construction is going to be similar to the regular zipper pouch. The key things are to make sure that when you sew the side seam, particularly next to the zipper, you are keeping this edge nice and straight. It should not be pivoting. This here, where your lining and your exterior meet up, should be nice and flat. So that is the bit that I'm going to focus on, and then I'm going to sew up the rest of the pouch. I want to make sure that my folds meet up, so where my exterior and my lining meet, I'm going to match those up and place a staple to keep them lined up. Staple is within the seam allowance. Check that it didn't shift. Repeat for the other end of the zipper. Match up the folds, pulling it out nice and straight. Make sure the prongs are folded flat. And something else that you can do, if you like, is at this edge here. Now we got to pull it straight, even though it seems like it's not going to be right, because it wants to sit like this, and then you have the bunching. You want to pull that away. And that is because of the angled shape of the finished bag. You can just draw in your 3/8 of an inch seam allowance here at the side to make sure that when you're sewing, it's nice and straight, especially if you're going to use a zipper foot or a foot that is harder to gauge your seam allowance. I'm going to sew this section first with my zipper foot, and then I'm going to switch over to my regular presser foot to finish sewing the rest of the exterior and the lining, all of those side seams. So I'm holding the lining back out of the way. If I leave it, it's going to be bunched up. So I need to hold it to the side, and I want to make sure that this is nice and straight here. And I'm just first going to sew that little section next to the zipper. And I'm using my zipper foot because it's kind of narrow, and I want to make sure that I can get the correct seam allowance. So I have drawn that in, and the staple is keeping the edges lined up. So I'm just going to sew a section about 2 inches, an inch on the exterior and an inch on the lining. Back stitching at both ends. So I've just sewn that little section there. I'll do the same on the other side, making sure it's pulled nice and straight here. It's a little bulky at that join between the exterior and the lining, you can use your hump jumper. Keep it going nice and straight. And now I can switch to my regular presser foot and sew around the rest of the edges using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance or whatever seam allowance is given in the pattern that you're using. If on the bag that you are sewing up, this edge is not straight, then the bottom of your bag is not going to be straight. That needs to be squared up in order for your bag to sit flat when you are done. If you haven't seen my Better Boxed Bottoms video, that goes into detail how to correct that. It should be a nice straight line here when you're boxing that corner. If your pattern bows out here, then it needs to be adjusted. Once you finish sewing around the outside of your bag, you can turn it out the right way. I like to go to the inside of my bag at the end of my zipper and open out that seam allowance. By butterflying it open, I can get my seams at the corner to sit a little more neatly. Optionally, you can also add some double-sided tape within the seam allowance and press that to the side. If you put in any staples, make sure that you remove those too. Some people opt to trim back this seam allowance. I prefer not to do that because I worry about my seams unraveling when I snip off the back stitching, but that is something that you can do if you want to. Then you would just close up your lining as usual, and there you have it. You have a zipper pouch with a convex curve. However, at the side, you have a nice straight edge that doesn't dip down. And the zipper is a good length to fit across the top without gaps at the end. As I mentioned, there will be a link to a pattern template that is the Pythagorean pouch with the curved top added to it so that you can try this for yourself. It does have an adjusted lining piece included in that pattern template also. And I'll be covering the concave curved zipper in the next installment of the Zipper Skills series. Hope that helps. Thanks everyone.